The next morning, I explored more cautiously, staying close to the cabin. I checked the perimeter, walking around the small clearing to see if I could spot anything unusual. That's when I noticed footprints in the soft earth near the stream. They were human. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. They led from the forest into the clearing and then stopped abruptly. I felt my stomach knot. Someone had been nearby, someone had been watching. My rational mind tried to explain it. A hiker, a camper, someone passing through. But the feeling of being observed clung to me like a shadow. I started to take precautions. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, even though there was only the front door and a small back window. I kept the lantern on at night, and I made sure the stove fire never went out completely so I would always have some light and warmth. Every sound outside made me tense. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of a bird. But one sound, in particular, started to unsettle me the most. Footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, always outside, circling the cabin. I could never catch sight of whoever it was. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the wind made noises that sounded like someone walking, but the unease persisted. On the third day, I decided to take a longer walk to try to calm myself. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and followed the stream further into the forest. The trees grew thicker, the shadows longer. I stayed alert, every sense straining. That's when I noticed something else. Signs of a fire, recently extinguished. Charred wood and ash, carefully placed stones in a circle, and footprints leading back into the trees. Someone had been camping nearby, someone who had intentionally avoided me. The thought made my chest tighten. I hurried back to the cabin, staying close to the trail I had marked. When I returned, I checked the cabin meticulously. Nothing was out of place. The windows were still locked. The door had not been touched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the fourth day, my sleep had deteriorated completely. Every sound outside became terrifying. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. I tried to read and distract myself, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. In the early evening, I noticed something on the porch. Small, subtle scratches along the wood, deep enough to be deliberate. My hands shook as I examined them. Someone had been there. Someone had come close enough to leave marks. I thought about leaving, about getting in my car and driving as fast as possible down the mountain road. But the forest made it difficult. My car was blocked by fallen branches that had not been there when I arrived, likely caused by the wind, but the timing made me tense even more. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern close, checking the windows every few minutes. Around midnight, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone moving around outside, circling the cabin slowly. My heart pounded. I sat frozen, listening to the crunch of boots on leaves, the snap of branches under deliberate weight. Hours passed, but I couldn't tell time. Eventually, the noises stopped, leaving only the wind and the occasional rustle of the trees. The next morning, I made a decision. I would leave at first light, no matter what. I packed my bag quickly, making sure the essentials were ready, my hands trembling. I glanced out the window one last time and froze. Footprints led directly from the edge of the forest to the cabin door, stopping abruptly at the steps. I realized with a jolt that the person, or people, had been there, standing close enough to see inside while I slept. My stomach turned. I didn't wait to see if they were still there. I rushed to my car, heart hammering, and started the engine. Driving down the mountain, I couldn't shake the images. The scratches, the footprints, the shadowy movements. I felt violated, exposed, and shaken in a way I had never experienced before. By the time I reached the main road and stopped for gas, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by exhaustion and a lingering sense of fear. I knew I had been lucky. I had no idea who had been watching me or why, but I knew I had been alone with them in the forest. In the weeks after, I thought about returning, about trying to reclaim the cabin or find some closure, but I realized it didn't matter. The forest had been my sanctuary in theory, but it had also made me vulnerable, exposed in a way no city or town ever could. I never went back. I stayed with friends for a while, slept with doors locked and lights on, and eventually started to feel normal again. But even now, years later, I can't walk in a dense forest without remembering the weight of that week. The fear that someone could be out there, watching quietly, waiting. The experience taught me that isolation can be more dangerous than anything you imagine. That the real terror is not what you see, but what you don't. Looking back, I realize I survived not because I was clever or prepared, but because of luck, vigilance, and a constant awareness that my surroundings were not as empty as they seemed. The cabin itself was safe, solid, and harmless, but the people or the one person who had approached it had made it feel like a trap. I learned the importance of caution, of never underestimating the potential for danger even in a place that looks peaceful and isolated. In the end, leaving was the only clear and safe choice, and I was grateful for that clarity, for the chance to return to the world and the security of civilization. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything, a chance to disappear into the wilderness and forget about work, phones, people, everything. I drove deep into the mountains, following narrow, winding roads that became dirt paths, passing signs warning of rough terrain and advising caution. The farther I went, the less I saw other vehicles, until I was the only one on the path, surrounded by dense pine forests and rocky hills. I parked my car at a small clearing where a trailhead began. It was early afternoon, and the sun was still high. I unloaded my backpack, which was heavier than I expected, filled with all the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, water, food, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight. I had chosen this spot because it was supposed to be isolated, but still reachable by the trail. I wanted quiet, but as I started hiking, I realized quiet had a way of becoming oppressive when there was nothing around but trees, rocks, and the occasional bird. The trail was steep in places, loose gravel and uneven rocks making every step deliberate. I passed a small stream, the water cold and clear, reflecting the sunlight. I took a sip and filled my water bottle, careful not to disturb the rocks in the streambed. The forest was thick, the trees growing close together, their shadows long and dark as the afternoon progressed. I could hear twigs snapping under my boots, leaves rustling, the occasional bird call. Everything sounded exaggeratedly loud because there was nothing else to mask it. I finally found a spot that seemed perfect for camping just as the sun began to dip lower behind the trees. It was a small clearing, flat enough to pitch a tent, surrounded on three sides by tall pines and a low rocky hill at the back. I set up the tent, hammered the stakes into the hard soil, and arranged my gear inside. I made a small fire pit with stones I found nearby and gathered dry wood, twigs, and pine needles for kindling. The sun disappeared behind the mountains while I worked, leaving a faint orange glow in the sky. Shadows deepened, and the air cooled quickly. Once the fire was going, I sat close to it, feeling the warmth, watching the flames dance and listening to the woods around me. The sounds of the forest at night were completely different from the day. Insects buzzed, small animals rustled through the underbrush, and the wind whispered through the trees. Everything was alive, but invisible. It was a pleasant feeling at first, calming in its isolation. I cooked a small meal over the fire, simple camping food, canned beans, a little sausage, and some bread. After eating, I cleaned up carefully, making sure no food was left out to attract animals. Night fell completely, and the darkness was absolute. The moon rose over the trees, casting dim light, but the forest floor was mostly black. I sat by the fire, letting it burn low, feeling a strange tension I didn't understand at first. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost like footsteps, but slower, deliberate. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer, maybe the wind. I listened closely. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, careful, deliberate steps breaking twigs. My heart rate increased. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness beyond the fire. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating nothing but trees and brush. The steps stopped again. I turned slowly in a circle, scanning every inch of the darkened woods. Then I noticed movement, low to the ground, slow, deliberate, something or someone creeping along the edge of the clearing. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But the way it moved didn't feel right. Too careful, too precise, almost like it was avoiding making any sound at all. I had always loved camping. The sense of getting away from the noise and pressure of everyday life, of being out in the wilderness with nothing but what I carried in my backpack. I had spent years hiking and camping alone, thinking I knew the forests well enough, thinking I was careful and prepared. That summer, I decided to try a remote area deep in the mountains, a place I had read about in an old trail guide. It was far from roads, far from cell service, and the kind of place where few people ventured. That was exactly what I wanted, a complete escape. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food, extra clothing, first aid kit, rope, a map, compass, and a sturdy knife. I even brought a small folding shovel just in case. Everything was meticulously checked. I thought I was ready. The first day of the hike went smoothly. The trail was steep but well marked at first, winding through thick pine forests, with the smell of wet earth and resin filling the air. I moved slowly, making sure I didn't strain myself too early. Birds flitted between trees, squirrels chattered, and the occasional deer crossed my path, stopping to stare before disappearing silently into the undergrowth. The sun was strong, cutting through the branches in golden slants, and the sound of a small creek running nearby was constant and comforting. By late afternoon, I had reached a clearing where I planned to set up camp for the first night. The clearing was small but level, surrounded by a natural wall of tall pines. The ground was soft but firm, covered in pine needles, and I spotted several flat rocks near the creek that I figured would make good seats. I unpacked slowly, carefully laying out my tent and inspecting it. I had chosen a lightweight model, one I could manage alone, but it was sturdy enough to withstand rain and wind. After staking it down and setting up the rainfly, I moved on to gathering firewood. The forest around me was dense, and I could feel a kind of heaviness in the air. The wind moved through the trees with a whispering sound that made my skin crawl more than I expected. It wasn't fear exactly, but the kind of alertness that creeps over you when you're aware of how alone you are. I set up a small fire pit near a rock that jutted slightly from the ground. The sun was dipping low when I finally got the fire going. The smell of smoke mixed with the forest air, and the flickering flames cast a warm light across the clearing. I cooked my dinner, freeze-dried pasta with dehydrated vegetables, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. As darkness fell, I noticed the forest around me seemed to change. Shadows stretched and moved oddly in the firelight. Every small crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set me on edge. At one point, I thought I saw movement just past the tree line. A figure, maybe, or a deer. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was my imagination, the play of firelight on the forest floor. I checked my surroundings carefully. The clearing was small, enclosed by trees, and I made sure there were no dead branches overhead that could fall. I went over my supplies once more. Knife within reach, backpack near the tent entrance, water at hand. I wanted to sleep but found I couldn't fully relax. Around midnight, I was awakened by a strange noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a coyote, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It wasn't the light, quick steps of a small animal. It was a crunching, shuffling noise, like someone or something walking slowly through dry leaves and twigs. I froze, my breathing shallow, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then resumed, circling the clearing. My first thought was to grab my flashlight and look, but I hesitated. Flashlights draw attention, and if there was a human, it would reveal my position. The noise got closer. My instincts screamed to pack up and leave immediately, but I was too tired, too weighed down by the hours of hiking and carrying my gear. Instead, I sat up in the tent, trying to calm my racing heart. The shuffling continued, circling the clearing, stopping for a moment, then moving again. It was methodical, patient. I tried to remember the stories of wild animals attacking campers, but none of them sounded quite like this. Coyotes make yips and howls. Bears make grunts, not the slow, cautious, almost deliberate steps I was hearing. I considered my options. I could leave the tent and try to make a run for higher ground, but that would mean exposing myself in the dark, into the forest, without any idea of what was out there. I could stay quiet, hope whoever or whatever was out there lost interest. I stayed, holding my knife in my hand, listening. I remember how cold my fingers felt, how fast my heartbeat was, and how every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. The minutes dragged. I kept imagining faces, shadows, branches breaking. Then I heard something else. A low, grating sound, almost like someone dragging a boot along the rocks near the creek. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a raccoon. It sounded like a person. Someone was there, circling me. My mind ran through every possible scenario. Lost hiker, desperate wanderer, someone who might be dangerous. The thought of a person with ill intent made my hands shake. I gripped my knife harder. I decided I had to act. I slowly, carefully, unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly. The clearing was dim, shadows stretching far beyond the firelight. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the creek. They were large, booted prints, heavy, and they hadn't been there when I set up camp. My stomach tightened. Someone had been walking around my campsite while I slept. I knew I had to leave. Slowly, silently, I packed the essentials. Knife, flashlight, water, and backpack. I left the fire, thinking I could put it out later, and stepped into the trees. The darkness was almost complete, and I moved as quietly as possible, sticking to areas where moonlight barely reached. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt like it would announce my presence. I didn't know if the person or people were still there. I didn't know what their intentions were. All I knew was I had to get out of that clearing. I followed a small slope uphill, hoping to find a trail. I kept my ears open, straining for the shuffling sound again. For what felt like hours, I walked in near silence, moving slowly through thick underbrush. Every rustle, every crack made me freeze. I realized I had no signal, no way to call for help. I had to rely entirely on my own instincts, on the map in my hand, on the faint trails I could see in the moonlight. Eventually, I stumbled across a faint path, narrow and overgrown but unmistakably a trail. My heart lifted slightly, though I stayed cautious. I followed it, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. I kept thinking about what could have happened if the person had followed me, if I had run earlier and been spotted. Fear and adrenaline pushed me forward. After hours of careful hiking, the first signs of dawn appeared. The sky was a pale blue, and the forest lightened, revealing the rugged terrain around me. I found a stream and drank water, splashing some on my face. My legs were sore, my body exhausted, but I felt a small sense of relief. I realized I had put distance between myself and the clearing, and the first light of day made me feel safer. I followed the trail down a ridge, moving towards a lower valley where I hoped I would find a ranger station or a road. By late morning, I finally saw signs of human presence. An old logging road, overgrown but clear enough to follow. I moved carefully along it, constantly scanning the surrounding forest. The further I went, the more relaxed I felt, though I still couldn't shake the memory of the shuffling footsteps and the unknown person in the dark. By late afternoon, I finally reached a small park road. Cars passed occasionally, and the sound of engines and human voices brought me relief like nothing else had. I flagged down a passing truck, explaining my situation. The driver radioed a ranger team, and I was taken to the nearest station. They listened to my story carefully and asked for details about the location. A search was started for anyone who might have been in the area illegally. I was safe, but the experience left me shaken. Later, I returned with the authorities to the campsite. The clearing was empty, silent, and peaceful in the daylight, but I could still see the traces. Boot prints, flattened grass, a few broken branches. It was a reminder of how close I had come to danger and how carefully I had managed to avoid it. I realized that no matter how much you prepare, the wilderness can be unpredictable. Not only in terms of animals and terrain, but also because people themselves can be a threat. That experience changed the way I approached camping forever. I never went to an isolated area alone again. I learned the value of caution, of listening to instincts, and of always having a plan to leave quickly. I still hike and camp, but I make sure someone knows where I am, carry a whistle, and never underestimate the quiet presence of others who might be watching. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it can also hide dangers far more human and deliberate than I had ever imagined. Even now, when I hear stories of campers disappearing or finding themselves in unexpected peril, I remember that night. I remember the shuffling, the careful circling of the clearing, the silent footsteps that could have ended everything. And I remember the relief of finding that trail, that road, that eventual safety. It was a lesson in vigilance, patience, and the raw reality that in the wilderness, your survival often depends on the smallest choices, the tiniest precautions, and the sheer will to keep moving, even when every instinct screams to run. I had a small knife in my backpack, a multi-tool, and a flare gun. I grabbed the knife and held it in my hand, the metal cold and heavy. The steps moved around the perimeter of the clearing, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving again. I tried to remind myself of all the survival advice I had read. Stay calm, make yourself look bigger, keep your fire going. I added more wood to the flames, the fire flaring up and casting jagged shadows into the forest. Hours passed like that. Every small noise made me jump. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. I stayed close to the fire, crouched, trying to make myself invisible. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, but it was hard to tell if it was my own, loud in my ears, or coming from somewhere in the darkness. Sleep was impossible. I ate nothing more, afraid that the smell would give away my position. My mind raced with possibilities, worst-case scenarios playing over and over. Around 3 a.m., the movement stopped. The forest became silent again, except for the natural sounds of night. I was exhausted, barely able to hold the knife, my hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. I decided to try to rest, keeping one eye open, one hand on my knife, the fire between me and the dark. I curled up near the embers, shivering from cold and tension. I dozed lightly, every sound sending me back to full alert, until the first hint of dawn. Morning brought light, but not relief. The forest looked completely different, shadows retreating, revealing dense undergrowth and fallen logs. I left the tent standing, too nervous to pack up quickly, and walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any signs of what had been out there. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence at all. It was as if whatever had been circling me had vanished into the forest without a trace. I told myself it must have been an animal or my imagination, but a part of me refused to believe that. I decided to move from that spot. I packed my things quickly, making sure everything was secured and no food or trash was left behind. I kept the knife ready and the flare gun within reach. The hike back was tense, but daylight gave me courage. The trail was slippery with morning dew, and the rocks were slick, but I moved steadily, focusing on putting distance between myself and the clearing. It was mid-morning when I finally reached the dirt road where I had parked. The car looked exactly the same as I left it. I got in and locked the doors immediately, checking all around the clearing from the windows. Nothing. I started the engine, hands trembling slightly, and drove back down the winding road, refusing to look in the forest again. The drive out of the mountains felt surreal, like leaving one world and entering another. After I reached civilization, I stopped at a small diner to eat something warm and drink coffee. My hands were still shaking, but I forced myself to sit and breathe, to eat, to process what had happened. I knew I would return home safely, that I had survived, but the tension of the night stayed with me. Every little sound in the diner made me flinch. Every shadow on the wall made me glance over my shoulder. In the following days, I thought a lot about that night. I realized that camping alone in an isolated spot carries real dangers. Not from ghosts or legends, but from the real world. Animals, other humans, accidents, and the terrifying vulnerability of being alone in the wilderness. I decided I would continue to camp, but never alone again. never without a plan for emergencies, and always respecting the unpredictable power of nature. I made sure to invest in better gear, more safety equipment, and to research trails and areas more carefully. The experience left me more cautious, but also more aware of the delicate balance between preparation and survival. It took weeks for the tension to fade, but it never completely left. Even months later, I still felt a knot in my stomach when walking alone in forests or hearing movement in the dark. But I also learned the importance of facing fear, of preparing for the worst, and of understanding that the wilderness is always real, alive, and sometimes dangerous, and that the safest choice is respect, preparation, and caution. That weekend had scared me more than I had ever been in my life, but it had also taught me something I could never unlearn. Nature does not forgive carelessness, and solitude, while peaceful, is also profoundly exposing. From that trip onward, every camping trip I planned involved careful preparation, detailed plans, and often friends or family. The fear never fully left, but it became a quiet reminder of what had happened, a shadow at the edge of my mind, sharpening my awareness and forcing me to respect every step I took in the wild. The memory of that night, circling footsteps in the darkness, the silence that followed, and the fire's warmth stayed with me. I understood fully now that surviving the wilderness is not just about strength or endurance. It's about patience, observation, and the recognition that at any moment, something unexpected can happen. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also made me more alert, more careful, and ultimately more alive. I had gone seeking solitude and peace, and what I found was fear and awareness, lessons I carried for the rest of my life. I considered my options. I could leave the tent and try to make a run for higher ground, but that would mean exposing myself in the dark, into the forest, without any idea of what was out there. I could stay quiet, hope whoever or whatever was out there lost interest. I stayed, holding my knife in my hand, listening. I remember how cold my fingers felt, how fast my heartbeat was, and how every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong. The minutes dragged. I kept imagining faces, shadows, branches breaking. Then I heard something else. A low, grating sound, almost like someone dragging a boot along the rocks near the creek. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a raccoon. It sounded like a person. Someone was there, circling me. My mind ran through every possible scenario. Lost hiker, desperate wanderer, someone who might be dangerous. The thought of a person with ill intent made my hands shake. I gripped my knife harder. I decided I had to act. I slowly, carefully, unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly. The clearing was dim, shadows stretching far beyond the firelight. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the creek. They were large, booted prints, heavy, and they hadn't been there when I set up camp. My stomach tightened. Someone had been walking around my campsite while I slept. I knew I had to leave. Slowly, silently, I packed the essentials: knife, flashlight, water, and backpack. I left the fire, thinking I could put it out later, and stepped into the trees. The darkness was almost complete, and I moved as quietly as possible, sticking to areas where moonlight barely reached. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt like it would announce my presence. I didn't know if the person or people were still there. I didn't know what their intentions were. All I knew was I had to get out of that clearing. I followed a small slope uphill, hoping to find a trail. I kept my ears open, straining for the shuffling sound again. For what felt like hours, I walked in near silence, moving slowly through thick underbrush. Every rustle, every crack made me freeze. I realized I had no signal, no way to call for help. I had to rely entirely on my own instincts, on the map in my hand, on the faint trails I could see in the moonlight. Eventually, I stumbled across a faint path, narrow and overgrown but unmistakably a trail. My heart lifted slightly, though I stayed cautious. I followed it, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. I kept thinking about what could have happened if the person had followed me, if I had run earlier and been spotted. Fear and adrenaline pushed me forward. After hours of careful hiking, the first signs of dawn appeared. The sky was a pale blue, and the forest lightened, revealing the rugged terrain around me. I found a stream and drank water, splashing some on my face. My legs were sore, my body exhausted, but I felt a small sense of relief. I realized I had put distance between myself and the clearing, and the first light of day made me feel safer. I followed the trail down a ridge, moving towards a lower valley where I hoped I would find a ranger station or a road. By late morning, I finally saw signs of human presence. An old logging road, overgrown but clear enough to follow. I moved carefully along it, constantly scanning the surrounding forest. The further I went, the more relaxed I felt, though I still couldn't shake the memory of the shuffling footsteps and the unknown person in the dark. By late afternoon, I finally reached a small park road. Cars passed occasionally, and the sound of engines and human voices brought me relief like nothing else had. I flagged down a passing truck, explaining my situation. The driver radioed a ranger team, and I was taken to the nearest station. They listened to my story carefully and asked for details about the location. A search was started for anyone who might have been in the area illegally. I was safe, but the experience left me shaken. Later, I returned with the authorities to the campsite. The clearing was empty, silent, and peaceful in the daylight, but I could still see the traces. Boot prints, flattened grass, a few broken branches. It was a reminder of how close I had come to danger and how carefully I had managed to avoid it. I realized that no matter how much you prepare, the wilderness can be unpredictable. Not only in terms of animals and terrain, but also because people themselves can be a threat. That experience changed the way I approached camping forever. I never went to an isolated area alone again. I learned the value of caution, of listening to instincts, and of always having a plan to leave quickly. I still hike and camp, but I make sure someone knows where I am, carry a whistle, and never underestimate the quiet presence of others who might be watching. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it can also hide dangers far more human and deliberate than I had ever imagined. Even now, when I hear stories of campers disappearing or finding themselves in unexpected peril, I remember that night. I remember the shuffling, the careful circling of the clearing, the silent footsteps that could have ended everything. And I remember the relief of finding that trail, that road, that eventual safety. It was a lesson in vigilance, patience, and the raw reality that in the wilderness, your survival often depends on the smallest choices, the tiniest precautions, and the sheer will to keep moving, even when every instinct screams to run. I had planned the trip for months, checking maps, reading about trails, and making lists of supplies. I wanted a weekend away from everything. No city noises, no phones, no distractions. I had picked a small, remote forest campground several hours' drive from the nearest town. The kind of place that promised solitude and the chance to sleep under stars with nothing around for miles. I liked the idea of being completely alone with nature, but I didn't realize how quickly the forest could change from peaceful to unsettling. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying my backpack full of supplies, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, extra clothes, and basic survival gear. The campsite was on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and small rocks, but I found a flat area big enough for my tent. I set it up with practiced motions, hammering the stakes into the ground, making sure the rain flap was secure, and arranging my gear inside. I left a small space around the tent, the way I had learned, to give myself some room to move and avoid tripping in the dark. The sun was low when I started a small fire. I had brought dry wood, kindling, and matches, and I built the fire slowly, starting with twigs, then small branches, finally larger logs. I watched the flames catch and grow, the smell of burning wood filling the air, the smoke curling up through the pines. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of birds settling in for the night and the wind whispering through the trees. I ate a simple meal, canned beans and a piece of bread, then washed my dishes in a small stream nearby and dried them carefully before putting them away. As the sky darkened, stars began to appear, sharp and clear between the branches. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the quiet, feeling the heat on my face, and watching the flames dance. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it tightly around me, and tried to sleep. The night was colder than I expected. I had underestimated the drop in temperature, and the wind had picked up. I tightened the straps on my jacket and huddled into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound didn't fit. It was a low, crunching step, slow and deliberate, moving in a way that felt almost like someone was walking carefully but with intent. I froze, listening. The forest was otherwise silent. My heart started to race. I stayed still for several minutes, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some small animal. But then the noise moved closer, slow and steady, circling the tent. I tried to calm myself. I reminded myself I had a flashlight and a small knife in the tent. I reached for the flashlight, but my hands were shaking, and I realized my voice would give me away if I called for help. I stayed still, watching the shadows outside the thin nylon walls. I could make out shapes moving, dark against the dim starlight filtering through the trees. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I could hear the subtle crackle of twigs under weight. Then the sound moved again, now to the other side of the tent. I realized something was wrong. This wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too careful, and they circled the tent in a way that suggested someone was watching me. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to think. I had to stay calm, I told myself. If I made noise, whoever or whatever was outside would know I was aware of them. I quietly unzipped the side of the tent and peered out, just enough to see without being obvious. The forest was dark, thick with shadows. I couldn't see anything clearly, but there was movement. A figure, hunched slightly, moving slowly among the trees, coming closer to my tent. I froze. My mind raced. I didn't have a weapon capable of defending myself properly, and the nearest help was hours away. I thought about what I had read about in survival guides. Stay calm, make yourself appear bigger, make noise if you have to. But I also knew that making a sound now could provoke whoever it was. I decided to wait, hoping the figure would leave. Minutes passed like hours. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath. Every small sound amplified in my ears. The wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Then I heard it again, crunch, crunch, slow and careful, but now it was different. There was the faint smell of smoke, like a fire, but I knew my own fire had mostly died down. The sound came closer, and I realized it wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were several, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. I felt a cold sweat running down my back. My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately, but I had no car nearby. The road was miles away. I was trapped. I remembered I had packed a flare in my backpack. I hadn't thought I'd need it, but now I realized it could be useful. If I could get outside and light it, the flare might scare off whoever was circling me. I carefully reached for my backpack, trying not to make a sound, and grabbed the flare. I fumbled with it, striking it against the striker. The red flare ignited with a sharp hiss and bright light, stabbing through the darkness like a beacon. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I could see them now. Two figures crouched low, frozen in place as the flare illuminated the campsite. They were wearing dark clothes and masks, the kind used to hide identity. I could see their hands, the way they were gripping sticks or poles, maybe tools. I realized I had stumbled into someone's territory, someone prepared to cause trouble, and I had no choice but to act fast. I didn't wait to think. I threw the flare as far as I could into the underbrush, away from the tent. The light flared brightly, and the figures jumped back, startled. Then I ran. I grabbed my backpack, unzipped the tent, and ran through the trees toward the faint glow of the moon over the ridge. My legs burned, branches whipped against my face and arms, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear them moving again, running, but now slower, as if deciding whether to follow or not. I didn't look back. I ran for what felt like miles, stumbling over roots and rocks, slipping in the mud near a small creek, and forcing myself to keep going despite exhaustion. I knew if I slowed down, they could catch me, and that thought alone kept me moving. Eventually, I reached a narrow dirt road I had seen on the map, the kind where only one car could pass at a time. I collapsed beside it, panting, mud and scratches covering me. I could see headlights in the distance, someone coming. I waved my arms, screaming with every ounce of strength I had left. The car stopped, and a man got out. I explained as fast as I could, pointing to the forest, shaking with adrenaline. The man called the police while I tried to catch my breath. The officers arrived within what felt like hours, though in reality it was less than 30 minutes. They searched the area but found nothing. No one hiding, no sign of the intruders. I realized then how lucky I had been. If I hadn't been alert, if I hadn't had the flare, or if I had stayed in the tent hoping it was just an animal, I might not have made it out. The officers offered to drive me back to town, and I accepted without hesitation. The forest looked peaceful from the road, but I knew better. I knew the isolation I had sought was what made the danger so real. Sitting in the car, wrapped in a blanket, I thought about how quickly everything could have ended. I had come seeking solitude and adventure, but I had found something else. Awareness of how fragile safety can be when you are completely alone. In the weeks that followed, I stayed away from the woods. I read survival guides, bought more gear, and trained in self-defense. But I never went back to that campsite. The memory of being trapped, the sound of footsteps circling my tent, the fear of unknown people nearby, stayed with me. I realized that even in nature, the world could be unpredictable, and preparation was the only way to stay safe. The experience changed me. I still love camping, still love being outdoors, but I never take solitude for granted, never assume the forest is completely safe, and always respect the fact that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters but other humans. I know now that fear is a tool as much as it is a warning. It sharpens senses, heightens awareness, and can save your life. That night taught me lessons that no guidebook could, lessons I carry with me every time I pack a tent and venture into the wild. And while the memory of that night will never fade, I learned something else: resilience. Even when faced with a terrifying situation, when survival seems uncertain, staying calm, thinking clearly, and acting decisively can make all the difference. I returned home safely, shaken, covered in scratches and bruises, but alive. I documented everything, every step I took, every sound I heard, and every decision I made. I shared it with friends who camp, with survival communities, warning them that danger isn't always obvious, that the isolation of the woods can be deceptive, and that preparation is everything. The ending of my story is clear because I survived, because I acted, because I respected the danger. And that clarity, that hard-earned sense of safety and awareness, is what stayed with me. Even when I camp now, I never forget the lessons I learned on that terrifying night. I had been planning this trip for months, reading maps, checking trail reports, and stocking up on supplies. I wanted to get away from everything, escape the noise of the city, and spend a few nights alone in the forest. I had my backpack loaded with food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, and some emergency gear. My goal was a small, secluded campsite I had found marked on an old hiking map, somewhere deep in the hills, away from any established trails. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, and the early fall temperature would be cool at night but warm during the day. I wanted isolation, and I was getting it. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding over narrow roads lined with thick trees, the shadows stretching long as the sun dipped lower. By the time I parked, the air was already sharp and smelled of pine and earth. I checked my pack one last time, making sure I had everything secured, then set off on foot. The path was rough but marked by occasional orange trail markers. It was quieter than I expected, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant hum of insects. Birds called overhead, but they quickly faded as I climbed higher into the hills. By late afternoon, I had left the main trail and entered an area that looked like no one had walked through in years. Trees grew closer together, roots twisted across the ground, and the undergrowth was thick. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered patterns, casting strange shadows that made the forest feel alive in an unfamiliar way. I could see the small clearing where I planned to set up my tent, nestled between a rise of rocks on one side and a gentle slope of trees on the other. I felt a strange mix of relief and nervousness, the kind that comes when you know you are completely alone in the wilderness. Setting up the tent was easier than I expected. I found a flat spot with short grass and packed leaves, cleared the few sticks, and pitched it tightly. I laid out my sleeping bag, arranged my gear neatly inside, and hung a small bear bag with food from a nearby tree. I had no intention of taking risks with animals, especially bears or coyotes, which I knew were common in these hills. I spent a few hours exploring the area around the clearing, looking at the small stream that trickled down the slope, noting the kinds of plants and trees, and checking for signs of other hikers. There were none. Not a single footprint, not even a broken twig that didn't seem like it had naturally fallen. The silence was absolute except for the sounds of the forest itself, and even that started to feel oppressive as night approached. I built a small fire with some dry wood I had gathered. The flames crackled, throwing a warm glow across the clearing and making the forest beyond look darker and more impenetrable. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans heated over the fire and drank water from my bottle, careful not to drink directly from the stream without filtering it. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire, watching the shadows move and listening to the distant calls of animals. Owls hooted somewhere far away, and small creatures scuttled through the underbrush. The forest seemed alive with movement, but all of it was silent in the sense that none of it acknowledged me. After a while, I went into the tent and lay down in my sleeping bag. The ground beneath me was firm but uneven, the kind that makes you adjust several times before finding a comfortable position. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees and making the branches groan. The sound was unsettling, but I tried to tell myself it was normal. I had slept in the woods before, and this was no different. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I told myself it was the imagination, the kind of paranoia that creeps in when you are alone at night, far from the safety of roads and other people. Around midnight, the wind died down, and the forest grew utterly silent. Then, I heard a snapping sound, faint at first but growing closer. A branch breaking, maybe a small animal. I held my breath, listening. Another snap, then the rustle of leaves as something moved through the underbrush. My heart rate jumped, and I reminded myself to stay calm. I had a knife in my pack and my flashlight by my side. I reached for the flashlight and unzipped the tent slightly, peering into the darkness. The beam of light cut across the clearing and then into the forest. I saw nothing at first, only the shadows of trees swaying in the moonlight. Then something moved. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a person, but I couldn't be sure. I froze, my muscles tight. The movement stopped as soon as I focused on it, blending perfectly with the darkness. I waited, listening, but the only sounds were the normal ones of the forest. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or a fox, but the way it had moved, slow, deliberate, felt human. I had heard stories of people getting lost and stumbling into camps like mine, but this was late, and I was deep enough that I doubted anyone would be wandering here. I decided to stay quiet and not move, hoping it would pass. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a low, scratching noise started at the edge of the clearing. Not loud, but consistent, like something dragging along the ground. My mind raced. I thought about the possibilities: an animal, maybe a bear testing for food. I had taken precautions. My food was up in the bear bag. My pack was zipped. Nothing smelled particularly inviting. But the sound persisted. I sat up slowly, gripping my flashlight and shining it toward the noise. My hand trembled slightly. The light revealed nothing at first, just the shadows of the trees. Then I saw it. A figure, crouched, moving along the tree-line. It was human. My stomach dropped, adrenaline surged. My mind immediately ran through scenarios. Someone lost, someone dangerous, someone desperate. I knew the forest could be a dangerous place, not just because of animals, but because people can be unpredictable. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. My only options were to stay put and make myself as safe as possible, or try to leave quietly. I grabbed my backpack, made sure my knife was accessible, and unzipped the tent slowly. I had a headlamp in my pocket and turned it on, shining it toward the figure. There was no reaction, no sound except for the rustling of leaves as it moved along the tree line. I debated whether to run or stay. Running could draw attention, but staying felt like inviting trouble. I decided to take a cautious approach. I would grab my pack and move to a nearby rocky outcrop where I could see the clearing clearly and have a defensible position. I slipped out of the tent, careful not to make noise. The ground was cold and hard under my hands and knees as I crawled toward the rocks. Every snap of a twig beneath me made my heart leap. I got to the outcrop and crouched behind a boulder, shining my light across the clearing. The figure had moved, closer now, stepping carefully among the shadows. I could see enough to know it was wearing dark clothing, moving in a way that suggested caution and awareness. Whoever it was, they knew the forest. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, though it may have only been minutes. I considered my options again. I could try to confront the person, scare them off, or wait until they left. Confrontation seemed dangerous. Waiting seemed safer. I chose to wait, moving as little as possible, holding my breath when I thought I heard movement near the rocks. Eventually, the figure circled the clearing, then retreated back into the forest. I didn't hear anything for a long time after that, only the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. I stayed where I was until the sky began to lighten, turning from black to a dull gray. When morning came, I cautiously emerged from behind the rocks. The clearing was empty. I checked my tent. Everything was intact. My food was untouched. Whoever had been there had not approached closely enough to see me or interfere with my supplies. I knew I had to get out of there quickly, but carefully. I packed everything methodically, checking twice for any signs of the person still lurking. I left no trace of myself beyond the cleared spot where my tent had been, moving back toward the main trail. The hike back was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every movement in the underbrush made me flinch. I stayed alert, keeping my head up and my senses sharp. I stuck to the trail, avoiding any side paths or dense areas where someone could be hiding. Hours later, I finally reached the road where I had parked my car. The safety of the vehicle and the ability to leave the forest behind brought a wave of relief I had not anticipated. I drove home slowly, still on edge, replaying every movement and sound from the night before. When I got home, I told myself that this experience was a lesson in caution and respect for the forest, and for other people who might be there unexpectedly. I had escaped unharmed, my supplies untouched, and my awareness heightened. It wasn't a thrilling adventure story with danger overcome heroically. It was a reminder that even in familiar places, in what seems like isolation, unpredictability can appear, and the memory of that crouched figure at the edge of the clearing, moving silently among the shadows, stayed with me for a long time, a clear reminder to always be prepared, aware, and respectful of the wilderness and its unpredictable nature. I had always loved camping alone. The idea of being out in the wilderness, away from everyone, feeling the quiet of the trees and the wind, made me feel alive in a way I never could in the city. That summer, I decided to go further than I had ever gone before, into a section of the forest that was almost untouched. No marked trails, no other campers, nothing but me and the woods. I planned carefully. I packed my backpack with a small tent, a sleeping bag, some water, a portable stove, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I also had a map and compass, though I barely used them. I liked finding my way by the landmarks, by the rise and fall of the terrain, the bends of the creek, the shape of the ridges. I left my plan with a friend, telling them when I'd return, and I felt ready. The first day was perfect. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the occasional creak of branches high above. I hiked for hours, my boots crushing dry leaves, the air thick with the smell of pine and earth. I found a spot near a creek, a flat clearing where sunlight filtered down between the tall trees. I set up my tent carefully, laying a tarp underneath to protect it from dampness. I gathered firewood and built a small fire, enough to cook my dinner but not so large that it would draw attention. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the gentle rush of water, the distant hoot of an owl, and I felt calm, almost peaceful. On the second day, I pushed deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller and closer together, and the light dimmed. The terrain became rougher, with fallen logs, thorny bushes, and patches of mud. I tripped more than once, scraping my hands and knees, but nothing serious. I found a small pond, and the water was crystal clear. I drank carefully, filtering it first. Around the pond, the forest seemed thicker, more enclosed. I noticed the silence here was different. Not empty, but tense, like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as my imagination and set up camp a little farther from the pond, close to some tall fir trees for shelter. It was the third day that things started to feel wrong. I woke early, before sunrise, and the forest was eerily still. The birds hadn't started their songs, the usual rustle of small animals was missing, and even the creek sounded quieter, as if the world was holding its breath. I packed up my camp quickly and decided to hike back the way I had come, though I didn't follow the exact path. I wanted to take a shortcut, a path I thought I remembered from when I had explored that morning. At first, the shortcut seemed promising. The ground sloped gently, and the trees opened into a thinly wooded area. Then I noticed the air smelled wrong, like something had died, faint but unmistakable. I paused and scanned the trees. Nothing. I shook my head and kept walking, telling myself it was a dead animal somewhere, maybe a deer. But as I moved forward, I noticed signs of recent human activity. Footprints in the mud, discarded plastic wrappers, a broken stick that looked like someone had used it to prop up a makeshift shelter. I felt uneasy. I had expected the forest to be empty, and now it felt like someone else was watching, following, maybe even living here without leaving obvious signs. The path became narrower and harder to navigate. I had to scramble over rocks and duck under thick branches. My sense of direction faltered. The landmarks I thought I remembered were gone. I realized I had no idea where I was. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The forest was denser here, darker, and the temperature seemed to drop. Sweat formed on my forehead despite the cold. My chest tightened, and my legs ached from the uneven ground. Panic started to creep in, a slow, gnawing feeling that made my stomach turn. Then I heard it, a sound like a branch snapping, sharp and deliberate, coming from behind me. I froze, straining my ears. The forest was otherwise silent. Another snap, closer this time. I picked up my pace, trying to tell myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too precise, too heavy for a small animal. My heart pounded, my legs burned, but I ran. Not sprinting wildly, but fast, careful to keep my footing. My eyes darted around for any sign of the trail, any familiar marker, but the forest seemed endless, the trees all the same, the ground uneven and treacherous. After what felt like hours, my leg caught on a root, and I fell hard, scraping my palms and knee. I cursed quietly, trying to keep my panic under control. That's when I heard it again. A low, deliberate rustle moving closer, followed by a faint grunt. I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet and forced myself to run again. My flashlight was still in my backpack. I didn't dare stop to dig it out. I could hear my own ragged breathing, my pulse hammering in my ears. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees taller, the shadows longer, the air colder. As I ran, I saw something in the corner of my eye, a figure, hunched, moving between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the way it moved, deliberate, careful, the way it paused and then moved again, felt human. My stomach dropped. I had heard stories of isolated hikers encountering dangerous people in the woods, people who lived off the land and didn't take kindly to intruders. My hands shook as I pushed my body harder, ignoring the pain in my legs. I needed to get out. Night fell fast. The forest became nearly pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I finally stopped running to catch my breath near a small clearing. My legs trembled, my heart was still racing, and my hands were raw from scraping against rocks and branches. I realized I couldn't see the path back. Panic set in fully. I had no signal on my phone, no way to call for help, nothing but the dark forest around me. The snapping and rustling sounds had stopped, replaced by silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was watching. I knew I couldn't stay put. I remembered reading that staying in one place could be dangerous if someone was following you. I had to move carefully but quickly. I found a fallen log and used it as a makeshift guidepost, moving slowly, feeling my way around trees and rocks. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, listening for any signs of movement behind me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had lost all sense of time. I followed the sound of the creek, hoping it would lead me to a familiar spot. The water grew louder, and I stumbled over rocks, falling into shallow water and getting soaked. But I didn't care. The sound was familiar. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I emerged onto the edge of a trail I recognized. Relief crashed over me in waves so strong I could barely stand. I followed the trail slowly, carefully, until I saw the outline of my car parked where I had left it. My legs shook so violently I could barely unlock the door. I collapsed into the seat, shivering, wet, exhausted. I looked back into the forest, dense and endless, and I realized just how close I had come to getting lost forever, how easily I could have been trapped, hurt, or worse. I drove home in silence, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow, every snap of a branch. I realized that the forest was beautiful and peaceful, yes, but it was also unpredictable, dangerous, and alive in ways most people never see. I made a decision that day. I would never venture into uncharted territory alone again. I would respect the wilderness, plan better, and above all, never underestimate how quickly things could go wrong. When I finally reached my apartment, I unpacked my gear and checked everything carefully. Nothing was missing, nothing had been disturbed, but the memory of those dark hours stayed with me. Even days later, I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, feeling that cold fear creeping up my spine. I couldn't shake it, but I also knew I had survived, that I had made it out alive because I hadn't panicked completely, because I had kept moving, kept thinking. From then on, every camping trip I took, even near trails I knew well, I carried extra tools, extra water, and a plan for everything. I learned to respect the forest in a new way, not just as a beautiful escape, but as a living, unpredictable place where mistakes could cost you dearly. I never went as deep alone again, and I never took shortcuts. I had learned the hard way, but I survived, and that survival became a lesson I carried with me every time I left the safety of the roads behind. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Work had been grinding me down, and I was desperate to escape the constant noise of the city, the endless sirens, the honking of cars, the glare of streetlights that never seemed to go out. I wanted to disappear for a few days, to be surrounded by trees, the smell of damp earth, and the quiet hum of nature. I had a backpack, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, and enough food for 3 days. I was going camping alone in a remote area, a place I had found on an online map, far from any trailhead, far from people. The drive had been long, nearly 4 hours, but I didn't mind. It was all part of the escape. By the time I parked my car at the edge of the dirt road that led into the forest, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows stretched long and dark between the trees. I felt a familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with unease, that quiet tension you get when you know you are venturing into a place few people ever go. I double-checked my pack, tightened the straps, and started down the trail. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. Leaves crunched under my boots. Occasionally, a bird flew up ahead, startled by my presence. The first hour of the hike was easy. The trail was relatively flat, with soft dirt and scattered roots. I kept my pace steady, enjoying the quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I noticed small details, the way the light hit the moss on the trees, the way the air smelled richer as I climbed slightly uphill. I found a small stream trickling along the path, clear water moving over smooth rocks. I knelt, cupped some in my hands, and drank, feeling refreshed. This was the kind of peace I had been craving. As the sun sank lower, I realized I needed to set up camp before it got dark. I had a small clearing marked on my map about 2 hours further along the trail. It was hard to see at first, hidden by thick trees and underbrush. By the time I reached it, the last golden rays of sun were slipping behind the mountains. I started looking for a spot for my tent, careful to avoid rocks and uneven ground. Eventually, I found a flat area surrounded by tall pines. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and there was a slight rise on one side that would protect the tent from wind. I cleared away some sticks and rocks, rolled out my tent, and set it up. The work took longer than I thought because the fading light made everything harder. My fingers were stiff from the cold air, and the first shadows of night were creeping across the clearing. Once the tent was up, I set up my small stove and cooked a simple dinner of instant noodles and canned vegetables. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the food and the sense of solitude. After cleaning up, I crawled into my sleeping bag, planning to read for a little while before sleep. The forest was alive with sounds: rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the whisper of wind through the trees. I felt safe almost. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, maybe a fox. There was a soft, deliberate crunching sound, like someone stepping carefully over leaves and twigs. It was far off at first, just a faint noise beyond the trees, but then it moved closer. My heart rate spiked, and I froze, trying to convince myself it was an animal. I reminded myself that people did hike these trails, that there was no reason to panic. But as the noise continued, I realized it wasn't random. The steps were steady, slow, and purposeful, moving in my direction. I stayed still, holding my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my heartbeat. The rustling grew louder, then paused, then continued, circling around the clearing. My mind raced. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and this spot was supposed to be isolated. I considered shouting, but that felt dangerous, like it might draw attention. I tried to calm myself, thinking about survival tactics I had read about. I grabbed my small folding knife from my pack and slipped it into the pocket of my jacket, keeping my hands free. The noises continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. I stayed low in my tent, listening. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of movement outside the thin fabric. Shadows between the trees, tall and deliberate. I couldn't see faces, couldn't make out shapes clearly, but I could tell it was human. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. I realized that if someone was out here, alone, and approaching my camp in the dark, they could be dangerous. I tried to remember everything I had learned about being alone in the wilderness. Keep calm. Make yourself appear aware. Keep something for defense close at hand. I knew I couldn't outrun a person if they wanted to catch me, but I could make it difficult for them to find me or approach without me noticing. I slowly unzipped my tent just a little, enough to peek out without revealing my position. The clearing was dark now, moonlight barely filtering through the canopy. The figure or figures moved carefully, sticking to the shadows. I caught a glimpse of a jacket, dark pants, boots crunching over the leaves. I didn't panic. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think clearly. I remembered that most people in the woods are more afraid of confrontation than we are. They might just be lost or curious or looking for a place to camp themselves. But I couldn't take any chances. I decided I had to make them aware I was here without giving away my exact position. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in their direction, keeping my finger on the button so I could turn it off instantly if they reacted. The beam caught their face for a brief second. Young, maybe mid-20s, blank expression. They froze, then slowly turned and moved back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed in my tent for another hour, trying to convince myself it was safe, that whoever it was had moved on. I couldn't hear them anymore, and the forest had returned to its usual quiet hum. My heart was still racing, but exhaustion finally started to creep in. I forced myself to sleep, setting my knife by my side and keeping my flashlight within reach. I woke several times during the night to strange noises. Branches breaking, low rustles, footsteps that might have been human or might have been animals. Every time, I stayed still, listening, waiting for anything unusual to come closer. The hours passed slowly, the dark stretching endlessly. By the time dawn began to break, the sounds had mostly stopped. Light filtered through the trees, soft and gray, and the forest seemed almost peaceful again. I allowed myself to breathe. I ate a quick breakfast, packed up my gear carefully, and began the hike back to my car. Every step I took, I stayed alert, listening for any signs of pursuit or unusual movement. I kept my knife in my hand, ready, but nothing happened. The path seemed deserted, and the tension slowly eased as I moved further from the clearing. By the time I reached the dirt road where I had left my car, I was exhausted, sore, and relieved. I drove home without stopping, replaying the night's events in my mind. I realized how lucky I had been. I had been careful, alert, and calm enough to avoid confrontation, but the experience had left a permanent mark. It was a reminder that the wilderness is not always empty, that isolation can be dangerous in ways you don't anticipate. I never went back to that trail. I still camp occasionally, but I always make sure I am within reach of other people, that I have ways to call for help, and that I stay aware of every sound and movement around me. Even months later, I could remember the sounds of that night. The deliberate crunch of footsteps, the way the shadows moved between the trees, the feeling of being watched. I knew now that the forest could be quiet, peaceful, and beautiful, but also unpredictable and dangerous. I learned to respect it, to never let my guard down, and to always trust my instincts. That night taught me more about survival, awareness, and human nature than any guidebook ever could. I started keeping a small notebook with me on hikes, recording observations, locations, and any unusual encounters. I shared tips with friends who camped alone. I invested in a better flashlight, a whistle, and an emergency GPS tracker. Over time, the fear faded, replaced with respect and caution. I never forgot that night, and it influenced every camping trip I took after. I learned that being prepared is more than having the right equipment. It's about mental readiness, situational awareness, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Now, when I hike or camp alone, I carry that lesson with me. I notice every sound, every shadow, every movement in the periphery of my vision. I avoid secluded clearings like the one I stumbled into that night. I make sure someone always knows where I am, even if it's just leaving a note with my route. And though the fear from that night has never completely disappeared, it has been replaced by a kind of quiet confidence. The understanding that preparation, awareness, and caution can make the difference between danger and safety in the wilderness. That night could have ended differently, but it didn't. I survived, I learned, and I became more capable, more alert, and more in tune with the world around me. And though I will always remember the crunching footsteps, the shadows, and the quiet terror of that night, I also remember the relief, the sunrise, and the journey back to safety. A journey made possible by patience, observation, and the refusal to panic in the face of the unknown. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything: phones, emails, work stress, people. I needed silence, air, and the raw, unpolished wild. I had chosen a small, relatively unknown national park that was 2 hours from the nearest town, a place where people went to hike and camp but not to gather in crowds. The idea was simple: set up camp deep in the forest, spend a few days hiking, cook my meals over a small fire, sleep under the trees, and wake up with nothing but the sound of wind and birds. I had done solo camping before, but this time I wanted to push myself further. I wanted to go deeper, to a spot a mile or two off the main trail, where the real isolation began. I arrived just before noon, parking my old SUV at the small lot near the main trailhead. The weather was clear, though there was a faint chill that hinted at approaching fall. I carried a medium backpack, not heavy, but loaded with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, canned food, a knife, flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I had also brought a basic map of the area, though I didn't plan to rely on it much. I preferred exploring by sight, by memory of the terrain, by intuition. The trail started easy. It was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, covered in a mixture of dirt and loose stones. Tall pines and oaks lined it on both sides, their leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. Birds flitted between the branches. Occasionally, I would see a squirrel dart across the path, carrying nuts. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the quiet that felt almost sacred. Occasionally, I passed small creeks or fallen logs where moss grew thick and soft. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine. After about 2 miles, I reached a fork. One path seemed to continue along the more maintained trail. The other veered sharply into a dense area of undergrowth. The latter was narrower, darker, and I could barely see where it led, but it felt right. It was less traveled, less obvious, and that's what I wanted. I took it. Almost immediately, the trail became uneven. Roots jutted up through the soil, small rocks threatened to twist ankles, and thick bushes occasionally brushed against my arms. I had to duck under branches and step over fallen trees. It was slow going, but the remoteness thrilled me. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing about half a mile off the trail. It was flat, just large enough for a tent, with a small stream nearby. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. I decided this would be my campsite. I unpacked quickly, setting up my tent, arranging my sleeping bag, and storing food carefully in a plastic container to keep animals away. I noticed the forest was quieter than before. The usual hum of insects was subdued, and the wind had dropped. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. I collected some firewood, dry twigs, and small logs, and started a small fire in the makeshift ring I cleared in the dirt. The fire crackled, sending up a spiral of smoke. I cooked some canned beans, adding a pinch of salt, and drank water from my bottle. The taste of simple food and the smell of burning wood grounded me. As the sun lowered behind the treetops, shadows stretched across the clearing, and the forest seemed to change. Felt bigger, older, quieter. I didn't feel scared yet, just alert. Night fell faster than I expected. The sky darkened to a deep navy, and the forest turned nearly black. I turned on my flashlight briefly, then put it away, relying on the firelight. That's when I first heard it. A soft crunch from the brush a few dozen feet away. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Nothing else. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, but my body stayed tense. Another crunch, closer this time. I felt exposed in the clearing. I grabbed my knife, not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted a sense of security. The noises didn't continue immediately. I tried to eat a little more, forcing myself to stay calm. I told myself the forest was full of creatures, all of them just trying to survive. I had to remind myself not to panic. The first night passed uneventfully, though sleep was difficult. Every small sound made me sit up, my eyes straining to see shapes in the darkness. By morning, I felt tired but relieved. I packed a light breakfast and decided to explore a little upstream, following the small stream. The forest remained thick, the path barely noticeable. Occasionally, I would come across tracks, deer, raccoons, even what looked like a fox, but nothing threatening. Mid-morning, I heard it again. A low rustling, something moving in the dense brush. I stopped and waited. Then I saw it, a man. He was crouched low, moving slowly between the trees, almost hidden. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then he stepped into a small clearing briefly, just enough for me to see his face. He looked rough, unkempt, dirty clothes, eyes wary, and he froze when he saw me. My stomach dropped. I had read about people living in the woods, sometimes harmless, sometimes desperate and dangerous. I backed away slowly, trying not to provoke him, my mind racing. I couldn't run, he might follow, but I couldn't stay either. I moved carefully along the bank of the stream, keeping trees between us. I didn't take my eyes off him. He didn't make any noise, just watched. Eventually, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow. I returned to my camp as quickly and quietly as possible. For the rest of that day, I stayed near the tent, keeping the fire alive and watching the surrounding forest. My food, my water, and even the knife suddenly felt more critical. I realized how vulnerable I was out here. Every sound seemed louder, the snapping of twigs, the hoot of an owl, the flapping of birds in the night. Sleep was nearly impossible that night. I kept the fire going, listening, waiting. On the third day, I decided to leave the area. I packed up early, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I retraced my steps toward the main trail, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt, large, human, fresh. They weren't mine. They moved parallel to the stream, but at a distance, sometimes closer. I felt panic creep in, a tightening in my chest. The forest suddenly felt oppressive, a maze. I tried to stay calm, but I was moving faster, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. Hours passed. The sun was lower, shadows growing long. I was exhausted, thirsty, and starting to question my route. I took a wrong turn at one fork, following what I thought was the main trail, but soon realized I was deeper in the forest. Then I saw him again. The same man, crouching near a tree, watching. He didn't approach, but the fact that he was still here, following or waiting, sent a wave of fear through me. I remembered a small ranger station on the park map, about 2 miles from the main trail. I decided to head there. I pushed through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks. My arms scratched, clothes torn. My backpack, once comfortable, now felt like a burden. I tried to ignore the exhaustion and fear, focusing only on reaching safety. The man appeared once more, closer now. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I considered running, but the terrain was difficult. My legs shook with every step, every snap of a branch making me flinch. I kept to a zigzag pattern, trying to stay out of sight, hoping the forest would shield me. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only 30 minutes, I broke through a thinner patch of trees and saw the ranger station. It was small, wooden, with a few parked vehicles. Relief washed over me like a wave. I ran the last few yards, shouting for help, waving my arms. The rangers appeared immediately, startled but responsive. I explained briefly, pointing toward the forest. They nodded, radioing for backup. A ranger and his partner went into the woods with 2 others to check the area. I stayed behind, shaken but slowly calming down. They returned after about an hour with no sign of the man. They assured me I was safe now, that I could drive to the nearest town and get food and water. They advised me not to return to that part of the forest alone, explaining that some people sometimes live in remote areas, hiding from authorities, and they could be dangerous if startled. I drove back that evening, exhausted but relieved. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to appear somewhere along the road. But he didn't. That night, in my small motel room, I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. My body ached from scratches, my mind replaying every rustle, every shadow, every step through the forest. I realized how quickly peace could turn into fear, how isolated I had been, and how fragile safety could feel. In the following days, I reported the encounter in detail to the local police. Rangers monitored the area for weeks, eventually discovering traces of a small hidden campsite, some food, and makeshift bedding. But the man himself was never found. It became clear that he had been living in the forest for an extended time, likely avoiding people entirely unless necessary. That experience changed how I approached the wilderness. I still camp, but never alone in unmarked, remote areas. I always leave a detailed plan, carry extra supplies, and keep emergency contacts close. Fear, I learned, was not something fictional. It was the sharp edge of reality, a reminder that nature is beautiful, yes, but also unpredictable, and that people, even hidden ones, can make that unpredictability deadly. Even now, months later, I can't walk through dense woods without a heightened awareness, every sound and movement making my heart race. The forest still calls me, but I know better. I know that being alone in the wild is not just about the elements. It's about every living being sharing that space, including those who, like the man I encountered, prefer to remain unseen. That day, I learned that survival is not just skill. It is alertness, caution, and respect for the unknown. I had always loved the outdoors. The smell of pine in the morning, the cold touch of dew on the grass, the sound of a river flowing somewhere in the distance. It all felt alive and honest. That year, I decided to take a solo camping trip deeper into the forest than I had ever gone before. I wanted to escape the crowds, the noise, the way people always seemed to be in a rush. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of wilderness where it felt like the world ended at the edge of the trees. I had been planning it for months, mapping trails, checking the weather, and packing carefully. My backpack was heavy but balanced. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, water filter, stove, first aid kit, extra clothes, flashlight, a small hatchet, and some basic tools. I had read about wildlife in the area, the risks, the precautions, and I felt prepared. The first day of hiking was exhausting but exhilarating. The trail was narrow, lined with dense bushes and towering trees. Birds chirped occasionally, but otherwise, it was quiet except for the crunch of my boots against the dirt and dead leaves. I stopped frequently, both to rest and to observe, feeling a strange mix of peace and anticipation. By evening, I had found a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, painting the sky with pale oranges and pinks, I felt completely alone in a way that was both calming and unsettling. Night fell quickly. The forest changed under darkness. Shapes became shadows and sounds multiplied. The rustle of leaves that had seemed harmless in the day suddenly made me jump. I reminded myself I was in a place where animals roamed freely. I had read countless reports of bears, wolves, and mountain lions in the area, but I told myself they rarely approached humans unless provoked. I had my pepper spray in my backpack, and my hatchet was by my side. Still, when I laid down in my sleeping bag, I could hear faint sounds that set my nerves on edge. The distant howl of a coyote, the soft thump of something heavy moving through underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I told myself it was normal, part of being in the wilderness. I tried to sleep, but I only dozed lightly, ears straining for anything unusual. Around midnight, I woke abruptly. At first, I thought I had heard a twig snap nearby, but the sound repeated, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone or something walking just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, straining my eyes into the dark. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting a dim glow on the forest floor. I debated whether to investigate or stay in the tent. My training in wilderness safety told me staying put was safer. I could hear the sound moving, slow, careful, circling around my tent. My heart pounded, and I gripped my hatchet tightly. My mind raced through the possibilities. An animal seemed most likely, maybe a bear sniffing for food. I had secured my backpack inside the tent, but even knowing that did little to calm me. The noise stopped abruptly. Silence swallowed the forest. I waited tensely, listening to my own heartbeat. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, closer this time, accompanied by another noise. A low growl, almost like a warning. My stomach dropped. Bears usually make that sound, and I remembered reading that black bears, though often timid, could be dangerous if they felt cornered or were protecting cubs. I stayed frozen, praying it would leave. It moved away, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I spent the hours watching and listening, my eyes adjusting to the moonlight. The stars were brilliant, shining through breaks in the canopy, but I barely noticed them. By morning, I was exhausted, but alive. I ate a quick breakfast and packed up, deciding to hike to a slightly less isolated area near a known trail. My excitement for solitude had turned into a keen awareness of vulnerability. The next 2 days of hiking were slow and cautious. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense. I saw tracks that could have belonged to bears, deer, and maybe even a mountain lion. I avoided traveling at night this time, setting up camp by mid-afternoon. I made sure to keep my food suspended in a tree, away from the ground, and I slept with my hatchet and pepper spray within reach. On the third night, I thought I had finally found a sense of calm. The clearing was small, but protected by natural formations of rocks and trees. I built a substantial fire and sat beside it for a long time, watching the flames and listening to the creek. The forest felt alive but not threatening. I even felt a small sense of pride in surviving the previous night. That night, something else happened. I was awoken by a strange, heavy breathing outside my tent. My first thought was that it was an animal, but the rhythm was off, too slow and deliberate. My stomach sank. I unzipped the tent slightly and peeked out. A figure stood just beyond the light of the fire, partially hidden by shadows. It was humanoid. My mind refused to believe it at first. Perhaps it was someone else camping nearby, but I had passed no one on the trail, and there were no signs of other campsites close by. My heart raced. I reached for my hatchet and whispered a warning to myself, telling myself to remain calm. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching the firelight flicker across the trees. I realized it wasn't wearing a backpack or holding anything. Its presence made me feel exposed, like an intruder in my own camp. Fear turned to instinct. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the figure. Its eyes reflected the light, and it moved quickly, but without a sound, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed awake for hours after listening. The sounds of movement in the forest grew heavier. Footsteps, snapping twigs, rustling bushes. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling me, observing, waiting. By morning, I had made a decision. I would leave this area immediately. I packed as quickly as possible, not bothering with breakfast, and hiked toward the main trail I had seen marked on my map. The forest felt different now. I wasn't just alert to animals. I was alert to humans, strangers, and the unknown. Each sound had potential meaning. Every shadow raised questions. I kept my hatchet ready, my flashlight within reach, and moved as quietly as possible. Around midday, I reached a small clearing where the trail split. I saw tracks in the dirt, human footprints, fresh, heading in the same direction as me. My heart raced. The prints were large and they had a distinct boot shape. Whoever they were, they had been following this trail, perhaps even watching me. I debated hiding, turning back, or running. I chose to keep moving, trying to appear as casual as possible. The forest felt claustrophobic, oppressive, though I was still outside in open air. As I moved, I kept scanning the edges of the trail. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees. Someone crouching, hiding. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to remain calm, breathing deeply, focusing on the trail. I remembered reading that panicking could make situations worse, especially if someone was following me. I stayed aware, alert, and deliberate in each step. Hours passed, and I finally reached a bend in the trail where it met a small river that had a visible, well-worn path on the other side. I crossed carefully, feeling a slight sense of relief. At this point, I realized I had been walking for over 6 hours without seeing anyone else, though I could still feel eyes on me, or at least I imagined them. I kept moving until I saw the signs of a main forest road. Vehicles and people were faintly audible in the distance, and I started to run toward that sound, adrenaline carrying me faster than I thought possible through uneven terrain. I emerged onto the road in the late afternoon. A couple of hikers passed by and offered a small smile, and I realized how tense and pale I must have looked. I thanked them silently and continued walking along the road until I reached the parking area where my car was. I locked the doors behind me and sat there for a long time, heart pounding, hands shaking, and trying to process what had happened. I didn't see anyone following me, but the feeling of being watched lingered. On the drive back, I reflected on the trip. I had come seeking peace, solitude, and adventure. Instead, I had learned a lesson about vulnerability in nature, about the balance between freedom and safety. I realized that despite all my preparation, the unknown could still reach me. But I also felt a sense of resilience. I had survived without making a single mistake that could have led to serious harm. My instincts, caution, and preparedness had carried me through. By the time I reached my home city, the stress began to fade, replaced by a sober appreciation for life and safety. I began to share my experience with close friends and fellow hikers, emphasizing the importance of preparation, vigilance, and respect for the wilderness. I never returned to that particular forest, but I continued to hike and camp, more cautiously and wisely than before. The memory of being watched, of hearing footsteps circling my tent in the dark, stayed with me for years, shaping the way I approached wilderness trips. In the end, The story of that camping trip wasn't about fear alone. It was about survival, awareness, and the thin line between adventure and danger. I had set out alone, unafraid of the forest, but the forest reminded me that even in the calmest, most beautiful places, danger existed. Yet I walked away intact, stronger and wiser. I understood now that nature is honest, neither cruel nor magical, but always alive. And sometimes, it tests you in ways you cannot predict. I kept camping, but I never underestimated the quiet power of the forest again. I invested in better gear, always kept communication devices charged, and never ventured into isolated areas without a clear plan. That trip taught me more than any guidebook could, about respect, caution, and the reality that even when you think you are alone, the forest and people can be closer than you imagine. And that awareness, patience, and caution can mean the difference between returning home safely and becoming just another story whispered among the trees. I had planned the trip for weeks, preparing carefully for a weekend in the backwoods of a national forest I had never explored before. I was going alone. My experience with camping had been moderate, enough to feel confident that I could handle the basics. A tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, and a map. I packed my backpack meticulously, triple-checking that I had everything I might need. First aid kit, headlamp, extra batteries, a small stove, dried food, water purification tablets, and a pocket knife. I also packed some heavier clothes than usual, anticipating the forest would be colder at night than I expected. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through quiet country roads, with only the occasional farmhouse and distant fields breaking the monotony. The forest loomed in the distance, thick with trees that looked older than any buildings I had seen in town. By the time I parked at the small dirt lot near the trail entrance, the sun was already starting to dip toward the horizon. Shadows stretched across the landscape, and a chilly wind whispered through the trees. I double-checked my map and compass before setting out. The trail was narrow, hardly used, with overgrown ferns brushing my legs as I walked. I felt the solitude immediately. There was no sound but the wind, the occasional bird, and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I liked that about it at first. The feeling of being alone in the wild was exhilarating. I hiked steadily, aiming to reach a small clearing the map marked as a campsite before dark. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, I arrived at the clearing. It was smaller than I expected, surrounded on all sides by thick underbrush and tall trees. There was a flat area perfect for my tent. I started setting it up, securing the stakes in the soil, feeling the chill of the coming night settle into my bones. I worked efficiently, my hands trembling slightly from the cold and fatigue, and once it was up, I moved on to unpacking my small stove and food. I boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, enjoying the warmth it brought as I ate sitting on a flat rock near my tent. The first night passed without incident, though sleep came fitfully. The forest was alive with noises. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the occasional distant howl of some animal. I tried not to focus on them, but in the dark, every sound seemed magnified, and I could not help imagining shapes moving just beyond my line of sight. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was relieved. Morning brought clarity, and the world seemed less threatening in daylight. I packed up my small campsite, storing my food securely in my backpack, and headed deeper into the forest. The second day's hike was longer than I anticipated. The trail became less distinct, twisting around fallen trees and through patches of dense underbrush. I constantly checked my compass, determined not to get lost. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take a short break beside a small stream. The water was clear, the sound of it moving over rocks soothing, and I sat on a mossy bank, eating a snack and resting my legs. It was there I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of light, a shadow moving quickly through the trees across the stream. But as I looked closer, I realized it was more deliberate. A man, or at least someone, was standing on the far side, partially hidden among the trees. I could not see his face, only the outline of his figure. My stomach sank. I froze, watching him. He did not move, as if he had not seen me, but the feeling of being observed was unmistakable. After what felt like minutes, I quietly stood, careful not to make any noise, and walked further down the trail, trying to put distance between us without showing that I had noticed him. The next hours were tense. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made my heart race. The forest that had seemed peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive. By late afternoon, I reached a small ridge that offered a view over part of the forest. From there, I could see the way the trail twisted through the trees, and I tried to reassure myself that I was still on course. I set up my tent in another small clearing, less picturesque than the one before, but sheltered and flat. I made sure my food was secured in a tight pack, strung up on a nearby branch in case of animals, and I spent some time examining my compass and map to confirm I knew exactly where I was. Night fell quickly. This time I was more anxious. I kept my headlamp ready and placed my knife beside me. The noises of the forest seemed louder, sharper. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a deep, guttural growl, and my heart jumped. I told myself it was probably a bear or a large animal moving through the underbrush. Still, I could not shake the feeling that something human was nearby. The growl sounded again, this time closer, and I realized it was not animal at all. It was too low, too deliberate. Sleep was impossible. I sat in my sleeping bag, knees drawn to my chest, listening. The forest around me seemed to breathe. There were rustles, footsteps on dry leaves, a sense that someone or something was moving slowly, deliberately, around my campsite. I held my knife tightly, peering out into the darkness, wishing I had chosen a more open area. Hours passed like this. Every movement, every shadow made me flinch. The growling came sporadically, always low, always menacing. Around midnight, I heard the first footsteps approaching my tent. Slow, careful, deliberate. Whoever it was, they were methodical, not panicked, not in a hurry. I pressed myself flat against the back of the tent, trying to make as little noise as possible, my mind racing. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, listening as the sound of twigs snapping under weight circled my small clearing. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. Then, a branch snapped close to my tent. I reacted instantly, grabbing my headlamp and knife. The beam of light illuminated nothing but trees. I moved cautiously to the edge of the tent, trying to see without exposing myself too much. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure, slim, tall, moving with a terrifying calmness. He was watching me. I realized then that I was not dealing with an animal, not with a random threat, but with a person who was intentionally stalking me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think. Running blindly in the dark would be foolish. I had a map, a compass, a plan. I decided to wait until he moved away, and then quietly pack up and leave in a controlled, careful manner. I waited, listening. The footsteps faded slightly, moving away but never disappearing completely. I counted my breaths, tried to remain as silent as possible. After what felt like hours, the forest seemed to settle, though I knew the figure was still somewhere nearby. At first light, I took action. I packed quickly but deliberately, making no sudden movements. I kept my knife in hand and my headlamp ready, though the daylight made the beam unnecessary. I moved slowly along the trail, constantly scanning for any sign of movement. It was then I noticed tracks in the mud, human footprints larger than mine, coming from all around the area I had camped. Whoever had been stalking me had been here all night, circling, watching, making sure I could not leave unnoticed. The hike back to the trailhead was agonizing. Every shadow seemed like a threat. I kept my pace brisk, but careful, ensuring I did not make too much noise. The forest that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. I relied entirely on my map and compass, ignoring the urge to take shortcuts or look for easier paths. By midday, I finally emerged onto a more clearly marked trail. Relief washed over me, but I still remained vigilant. As I approached the trailhead where I had parked my car, I saw no sign of anyone else. No one had been there. My car looked untouched, the keys exactly where I had left them. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe. I loaded my backpack into the car, double-checked the doors, and drove slowly out of the forest. Every turn of the wheel felt like leaving behind a nightmare that had felt inescapable. When I finally reached a main road, the feeling of danger began to recede. I drove home, constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the woods behind me. By evening, I arrived at my apartment safely. I unpacked my gear and inspected it, but there was no sign that anyone had touched it. The experience stayed with me for days. The sense of being watched, stalked, hunted, it was terrifying and vivid. Eventually, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They took my statement seriously, noting that others had reported a suspicious individual in that forest, someone who seemed to follow hikers but had not yet caused harm. The ranger advised me on precautions for future trips. Travel with others, make your campsite visible, keep a whistle or flare, and always let someone know your route and expected return time. I took their advice to heart. Though the trip ended safely, I never forgot the feeling of being alone in that forest with someone who had been silently following me. I never returned to that particular trail, and I made sure that every subsequent camping trip included companions and extra precautions. The forest is beautiful, peaceful, and serene when experienced safely, but I now knew how quickly solitude can turn into vulnerability and how careful one must always be, even in the wilderness. The fear was real, the threat human, and the lesson unforgettable. I had always thought of myself as someone prepared for the outdoors. I had read countless guides, watched hours of survival videos, and spent years gradually building up my gear and skills. So when I finally decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the northern wilderness, I thought I was ready. My plan was simple: hike a remote trail over 3 days, camp in a clearing near a small lake, and immerse myself in the solitude of nature. I packed carefully, double-checking my backpack to ensure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, food, first aid kit, and even a hand crank emergency radio. I had my map, a compass, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small hatchet. Everything was meticulously organized, my pack balanced and secure. I had done everything by the book, or so I thought. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. There were no cars except mine, and no other hikers were in sight. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sky was a deep, unbroken blue. I felt a thrill as I stepped onto the narrow path, my boots crunching over pine needles and fallen leaves. The first few miles were easy, a gentle incline that wound through dense trees and occasional rock outcroppings. Birds chirped, and a small creek gurgled nearby. I paused often to admire the scenery, feeling a sense of calm that only being in true wilderness can give. By the late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near the lake I had planned to camp at. The water was still and clear, reflecting the deep green of the surrounding forest. I chose a flat area a few meters from the shore to set up my tent. I worked methodically, staking the tent securely and checking that the rainfly was taut. Once it was up, I gathered firewood from nearby fallen branches, carefully avoiding any dead or rotten wood that might fail to burn. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I had a small fire going, a few logs crackling and sending up sparks that drifted lazily into the darkening sky. As night settled, the forest became alive with sounds I had never noticed in daylight. Insects buzzed faintly, owls hooted in the distance, and the soft slap of water against the lake's edge echoed in the quiet. It was peaceful, but also unfamiliar, and I felt the first stirrings of unease. I reminded myself I was alone and vulnerable, but I had prepared for this. I ate a simple meal of dehydrated food rehydrated over the fire, then cleaned up and crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire still smoldered as I drifted off, thinking I would sleep soundly under the vast, star-studded sky. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, my body tense. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint but unmistakable smell of smoke, but not from my own fire. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I realized the woods around me were eerily quiet. The usual night sounds were gone. A chill ran down my spine as I strained to listen. There was a faint rustling not far from my tent, but too slow and heavy to be an animal moving normally. My heart began to pound, and I forced myself to stay calm. I had read about wildlife encounters, about how bears and other animals might investigate campsites, and I knew I had to be careful. I unzipped the tent slightly, careful not to make a noise. Outside, the night was black and still, the lake reflecting a thin crescent moon. I scanned the tree-line, and then I saw it. A shadow moving with deliberate slowness, just beyond the tree-line. It wasn't the quick darting of a deer or the cautious approach of a small animal. This moved differently, methodically, almost as if it knew I was there. I froze, unsure whether to wake the fear that gripped me or to stay completely still. The rustling grew louder. I realized that whatever was out there was not just passing through. It was circling my camp. My instincts screamed at me to grab my hatchet, to be ready to defend myself, but I also knew that sudden movement could trigger a confrontation. I tried to stay silent, heart hammering, every sound amplified in the dense darkness. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a bear? But the shape was not right, too upright, too purposeful. I shook my head, trying to rationalize, but the rational voice felt small and weak against the pounding fear. The shadow seemed to pause, almost observing. I remembered my flashlight tucked beside me. I weighed the risk of turning it on. Exposing my location might provoke the unknown presence. I decided against it. I needed more information. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, the fabric pressing lightly against my cheek. It moved again, closer this time, a figure gliding between the trees. The moonlight caught a glint, metal or plastic, something man-made, not natural. Panic surged. I realized this wasn't wildlife. My mind refused to accept it at first, but the evidence was clear. Someone was out there, circling my camp. Alone, in the dark, miles from help. I felt a cold, sinking terror. I had to make a decision. Sitting in my tent waiting was dangerous, but running into the open night seemed worse. I remembered reading survival tips for encounters with dangerous humans in the wild. Stay calm, make yourself less vulnerable, and create a defensive position. I carefully retrieved my hatchet, keeping it close and my hands steady. I also had a small flare in my pack, a last resort signal, and I knew I might have to use it. The figure paused again, this time nearer, and I could hear faint snapping of twigs. My mind raced. What did they want? Could it be another hiker? Or someone looking to rob, or worse? I slowly slid out of the tent, staying low, my movements deliberate. I didn't run. I kept my eyes fixed on the shadow, ready to react. I crept toward the trees, keeping them between me and the figure, trying to stay hidden while finding a better vantage point. The shadow seemed to hesitate, then moved along the edge of the clearing, never fully revealing itself. My pulse was deafening in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, keeping a mental tally of escape routes. Then I saw it, a small pile of supplies that didn't belong to me, partially hidden under leaves. A backpack, a water bottle, some food wrappers. Whoever it was had set up a temporary cache, maybe waiting or observing. I realized I had stumbled into a dangerous situation. A trespasser who had been living quietly in the forest, someone who might be desperate, armed, or unstable. My fear spiked, but I also felt a surge of clarity. I needed to get out, and I needed to do it safely. I retraced my steps silently, staying in the shadows, circling back to the path I had taken earlier. The figure was still moving, but now more distant, as if following a parallel route. I didn't look back. I focused on putting distance between myself and the camp. Every crack of a branch under my boots made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves felt like it could betray me. I stuck to the darkness, using the natural cover of the trees, and eventually reached the trailhead where I had left my car. Relief was so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, shaking, trying to calm myself before driving. My phone had no signal, but I had the car's radio and emergency flashers. I debated whether to call for help immediately or try to get to the nearest ranger station. In the end, I chose to drive slowly toward the last known area of cell service. Every shadow along the road, Every movement in the trees made me tense, but I didn't stop. Eventually, the road opened up, and I could see lights in the distance. A small town, civilization. When I finally found a signal, I called the local authorities and reported the incident. They listened, asked questions, and promised to check the area. Later, I learned from the ranger station that someone had been living illegally in that part of the forest, known to move quietly and avoid detection. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. I had survived, but I knew how close it had been. In the days following, I reflected on the trip, the forest, and my choices. I realized that preparation and knowledge can only take you so far. Unpredictability is always a factor in the wilderness. What I had faced wasn't supernatural or imagined. It was very real, human danger hiding behind the beauty of nature. I knew I would camp again someday, but I also knew I would never forget the night I learned just how close isolation and vulnerability can bring you to fear you cannot simply imagine away. From that trip, I took away more than just survival skills. I learned patience, vigilance, and respect for the unpredictable nature of both the wilderness and the people who move through it. I also learned that clarity under pressure can save you when fear threatens to overwhelm. Most importantly, I realized that sometimes the scariest moments are not created by the wild itself, but by other humans, hidden and patient, waiting just beyond your vision, testing your instincts and your resolve. Even now, years later, when I drive past that forest or hear a faint rustle in the woods while camping, I feel a twinge of the fear that night brought. But I also feel a sense of accomplishment and resilience. I survived, I learned, and I carried that knowledge forward. That is the clarity that comes from true fear, the understanding that while you cannot control everything around you, you can control your reactions, your choices, and your will to keep moving forward. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, the noise, the constant pressure of work, and just disappear into the woods for a few days. I packed carefully, making sure I had all the basics: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, stove, food, water, and first aid supplies. I wanted to be prepared, but I didn't expect how much the forest would humble me. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning, the sun already high and warm, streaming through the cracks between the trees. I checked the map one last time, then slung my backpack over my shoulders and started down the narrow dirt path. The air smelled different here, clean but heavy with pine and damp earth. Birds chirped somewhere above, though I couldn't see them through the thick canopy. The path wound through gentle hills, under arches of tangled branches, and alongside small streams that gurgled over smooth stones. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked several miles, my legs aching slightly but my spirits high. I started looking for a spot to set up camp. I wanted a place that was slightly elevated, close to water, but not too close, because mosquitoes and other insects would be unbearable. After some searching, I found a clearing, small and round, with a mix of soft dirt and patches of grass. It was surrounded by thick trees, and a small stream ran a few yards away. Sunlight filtered in through the leaves, giving the clearing a golden glow. I dropped my pack and started setting up the tent. It took some effort to clear sticks and stones from the ground, but eventually, I had a small, secure space to sleep in. I unpacked my stove and began preparing a simple dinner: dried pasta with a little olive oil and some canned vegetables. The sound of boiling water, the smell of food cooking, and the warmth of the sun made the forest feel less intimidating, more like a sanctuary. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest had transformed. Shadows stretched long and twisted, and the air cooled rapidly. I finished my dinner and cleaned up carefully, making sure not to leave any scraps or wrappers that might attract animals. I had brought bear spray and a small knife, and though I didn't expect trouble, I felt a gnawing sense of vulnerability. I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped up the tent, the thin fabric between me and the night. At first, I felt safe, cocooned in the small tent. But as darkness fell completely, the forest became alive in ways I hadn't noticed during the day. I heard twigs snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the occasional high-pitched call of an unknown bird. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. I told myself it was just the forest, just animals moving around. Nothing more. Hours passed. I dozed lightly, waking often to sounds outside. At one point, I heard something heavy, deliberate, moving through the trees. It wasn't random. The weight, the cadence of the steps, made my stomach tighten. It was something big. I sat up slowly, trying to listen without making any noise. The movement stopped. I held my breath. Then it started again, closer this time, until I could hear the faint crack of a branch underfoot just outside the tent. My heart pounded. I thought about staying perfectly still, but I knew if it was a bear or a large animal, making noise might be dangerous. I grabbed my bear spray, keeping it in front of me, and waited. The sounds moved around the perimeter of my campsite, circling slowly. I could hear the breathing now, heavy and deliberate. My mind raced through every piece of advice I had ever read about wildlife encounters. Stay calm. Make yourself look bigger. Don't run. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the side of the clearing, followed by a metallic clatter. My stove had tipped over outside, probably from whatever had been walking around. Panic shot through me, but I stayed as still as I could. I waited for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear anything. Then, nothing. Silence, thick and heavy, pressing against the fabric of the tent. Morning came, gray and misty. I unzipped the tent carefully, peeking out before fully stepping out. The clearing looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. But as I walked over to check, I saw the signs. Footprints in the soft dirt, large and deep, leading to and from my campsite. Some were unmistakably human. Some were not. A tree branch had been snapped near the edge of the clearing, and my stove had been knocked over. Whoever or whatever had been there had been exploring, curious, testing me. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. I didn't speak, I didn't make noise. Every sense was alert. The hike back felt endless. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, a bird taking flight, a distant branch snapping, set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I had been less careful, if I had made a noise, if I had stepped out at the wrong moment. When I reached my car hours later, exhausted and covered in sweat and dirt, I locked the doors and sat for a long time, catching my breath. I called the ranger station to report the footprints and the disturbance. They said there had been reports of people hiking illegally in the area, some carrying weapons, and sometimes hikers had encountered them unexpectedly. They warned me to be more careful in the future. I realized I had been lucky. I could have easily been in danger. Driving home, I reflected on the experience. The forest was beautiful, but it was also unpredictable. It demanded respect, attention, and caution. I felt a mix of fear and relief. Fear of what could have happened. Relief that nothing worse occurred. I realized that camping wasn't just about enjoying nature. It was about understanding it, respecting it, and preparing for the unexpected. A few weeks later, I returned to the same area, but this time during the day with a friend. We explored, sticking to marked trails, taking extra precautions. I wanted to confront the fear I had felt, to understand the forest better. We found the spots where I had seen the footprints, and it was sobering to see how close the danger had been. I felt gratitude for my survival and a newfound respect for the wilderness. Camping would always be a part of my life, but I learned that it required vigilance, preparation, and humility. The forest was not a place for recklessness. It was alive, full of beauty and danger alike, and the line between them could be thin. That night, I finally understood the balance of fear and respect that keeps people safe in the wild. I left the forest with a sense of clarity, a deeper understanding of nature, and a commitment to never underestimate it again.